I will also ask all my panelists to speak slowly and close to the mic, so that the people online can hear you and that the translators can translate you. So our panel is expected to provide the creator's perspective. This morning we've heard the industry perspective, and to provide you with the perspective of the creators, we have PATRICIA-RIERA BARSALLO. She works for the International Affairs Department at AISGE, which is a Spanish collective management organization for actors. Present here, 3 days of discussions on music, and Patricia will be here to enlighten us about how it also touches upon our actors. Then we also have Chris Castle. You've just heard him speak. He has a history, because he has a history at Sony Music, at A&M Records, but somehow his past as musician caught up with him, and I think right now we can call him one of the biggest advocates of the artist community. So he's very active, you've heard that. He's also very active within the Artist Rights Institute, and he's an active commenter on all things that touch upon music and tech, so definitely including AI. Then we also have MARC MOULIN, our third lawyer in the panel. He also has a history. He used to work for the European Film Agency. He used to work for the Motion Picture Association. For Eurocinema, he even worked for the European Commission, but now he has turned to the real dark side. He works for the author societies. He works for ECSA, which is the European Composer and Songwriters Alliance, which is actually a coalition of different national federations of authors and composers. And then, last but not least, YIORGOS ANDREOU, I hope I pronounced that correctly. He is the true musician on our panel, so you have the biggest job in providing the creator's perspective. But he's also a lawyer. But he never made that his specialty. He specialized in psychoacoustics, sound engineering, production techniques, and he has a catalog of his own that includes songs, film music, theater music, lyrics, poems, a novel, articles, so we can say that you can train a small language model on his repertoire only. So these are the people that will enlighten you with the creator's perspective, and yesterday, I heard Miss Irini Stamatudi say that performers are actually less affected by AI. So the problem that we have to solve is not as big as the problems that other right holders have to solve, apparently. And then this morning, we had a very nice panel of the industry, and they seem to have the moral right. So they agree with us on everything, and they're looking for partnerships. So actually, everything looks okay. I think we can go home and start working. But is that the signal that your artists are giving you, and is that the signal that you, YIORGOS, give as an artist yourself? But I would like to start with Patricia. Is everything we've heard so far, does it correspond with what actors and musicians are telling you?
Not really. I have to say that since we found out in 2022 that there is an exception discussed in 2016 and approved in 2019 that covered the acts of exploitation that AI companies are doing when training their system with our content, protected content. We are surprised because it's like, okay, what this means? That you can use whatever you want without asking permission and with remuneration? And that's a reality. I mean, performers are not receiving any euro for this kind of exploitation. I like when you talk about the new safe harbor, and that's true. Despite the Commission insistence on the idea that this exception is working okay, the truth is that it's causing an unprecedented damage to the interest of our performers. First of all, it's not true that what they are doing is text and data mining, at least not all the process. Secondly, there is an exception that have a lot of faults. Instead, for instance, the output system. The output system is not efficiency at all. And thirdly, when you thought that, okay, it's an exception, so it's framed within the requirements of the three-step test, there is no way to justify that this exception meets the requirements of the three-step test when you see the impact on the market, on the interest of the performers. So this morning, in the first panel, I was very happy to hear Microsoft saying that they have a strong commitment with transparency and say that they don't allow the crawlers to pass paywalls without a previous agreement. But again, the reality say things are different. And for instance, Megatron, that is the Microsoft language model, was trained with open source data included in the book trees data set. That is a database that, according to a Danish study, has filled with a lot of pirated works. So if you have, as an AI company, this commitment with transparency, but you are not able to control who is your partner, who is providing you the content, you are not able to sit with the real representative organizations that represent performers. It's very difficult that this system could work. And this is only talking about the exploitation of their work. There are a full other impact in this issue.
Okay, but Mark, that is a performer-only problem, right? Because the authors, you have made opt-outs, and they are all being respected. So it's a performer-specific problem. That we're not ready to do this opt-out because the law says you can opt out. The authors have opted out. It is being respected, and licenses are being made every day. And so, can you, or am I wrong?
I appreciate the jokes. Of course, for us, there is no licenses so far. Everything has been taken without authorization, without remuneration, without transparency. This is, of course, probably the biggest issue for us at the moment. Thank you, Patricia, for what you said. I completely agree. I think when we talk about copyright exception, there are a lot of copyright exceptions. A lot of them make sense, actually. A lot of them, they meet public policy objectives. You have quotation, you have exception for libraries, you have exception for parody. All of those, they are here to find a balance between certain public policy objectives. It can be the interest of libraries, public institutions. It can be freedom of expression as well. This is very important. What is the public policy objective behind the commercial TDM exception in Article 4? I'm still trying to find it. And for us, it's important to take a step back, and I'm going to try not to be too long about this, but I think it's important to remember that at the beginning of the CDSM directive, there was no Article 4. Then you had the Parliament and the Council coming with an optional exception for text and data mining. Text and data mining is defined at the end of the process. And of course, at the end, the Commission came in and said, we don't like optional exception because it's against the internal market, so we want to have a mandatory exception. And then you add a definition which says automated technique to analyze text and data mining in order to generate information. That's what what is in the directive. So there is nothing about AI. The debate about AI was not existing at that moment. I think we are in Athens. Acropolis is probably, the place of birth of democracy. I'm not that proud of the EU when I see, this kind of slippery slope of terminology. And at the end of the day, with the Commission, unfortunately, agreeing to it to a large extent and to say, well, you can reserve your rights. The reality is that this exception has been applied, has been interpreted by AI companies without knowing its scope and without knowing, if you don't know the scope, you don't know how to reserve your rights as well. So this is, I'm sorry to say, a fucking mess. And this is not only me saying this. You have a lot of EU member states that have been saying that Article 4 applying to generative AI, it's not that clear. A lot of academics, now the European Parliament is also looking at this, and you have Axel Voss, with whom I wouldn't agree on everything, but who is probably the best place to say, well, generative AI was not part of this debate. So I think we have strong concern about this kind of democratic approach and about the rule of law in this case.
Chris, this is so European, all this opting in, opting out. I like what you said, that fair use is actually acknowledging that you're in a defense position. How is the US looking at this opting out? Do you have an idea of how the US creatives are looking at this right now? Do they want to join? Do they think it's a better system? Because, for instance, you talked about the contribution to the UK. In the UK, it is part of the discussion to introduce in the UK a similar system as in the EU with this opt-out thing. Mm-hmm. Is it also a discussion in the US?
Well, it's a discussion in the US that's driven mostly by the discussion over here, because we've never had an opt-out system in the US. This came up during the early days of the internet, like so many of these things are coming back now. And like with peer-to-peer, for example, when there was discussions about how to legitimize peer-to-peer, did you want people to opt in or opt out? And that didn't last. That conversation was pretty short-lived. So I think what our comment was in the UK IPO consultation was basically that the whole concept of opt-out is absurdly complicated. You cannot rely on robots.txt or anything that's automated, really, to facilitate an opt-out. I mean, theoretically, you think about it, well, wouldn't it be nice if, given that all these things work at such a rapid pace, wouldn't it be nice if we want them to succeed, for them to have an automated way of knowing whether or not people wanted their works to be contributed to the digital abattoir of AI? If you have to ask that question, right? I mean, the general position we took was to even ask the question is absurd, right? Of course, people don't want it, and if you think that somebody does, there's an easy way to find out, which is to ask them, right? And so I would say that generally speaking, I've seen no support in any artist community anywhere or in any category of copyright for an opt-out system. And you now have the next version of this, which is the Sora 2 videos of dead celebrities. I don't know if you guys have seen that. If you just go to YouTube and search for Sora, S-O-R-A 2, you will find Freddie Mercury promoting AI. as a wonderful thing, and Elvis Presley, which is particularly annoying in the United States because we just went through this whole thing with the Elvis Act in Tennessee, which was designed to prevent this exact thing. The issue came up during the AI moratorium debates in the Congress, and this exact thing was the reason why we didn't want to have the AI moratorium. So the whole idea of opt-out is ridiculous, in a lot of ways. And I don't think there's any support for it anywhere.
Okay. YIORGOS, you, as a musician, how do you opt out? Like, where do you make it machine readable so that all these companies like Google and Microsoft and MITDA, that they know, but he doesn't, or maybe you want them to analyze all the work you've done, but you as a musician, you're confronted with this in reality. They're taking your repertoire also into the big data set that they're using to train their models. What steps can you take to give them the signal, I don't want you to take my repertoire into that training process?
I would prefer to speak in Greek, if you don't mind, because I want to speak more clearly for a lot of things. But this I can say in English, that, language is a big trap. When we say content, and we don't speak about work of art, this is a starting of a main problem. Η μετατόπιση από το έργο τέχνης στο περιεχόμενο δημιουργεί ήδη μια τεράστια προσβολή για τον καλλιτέχνη. Το περιεχόμενο είναι μια αφηρημένη έννοια. Μιλάει για μια πλατφόρμα, μιλάει για μια αποθήκη, μιλάει για ένα όγκο από data, τα οποία όμως αυτά αποχαρακτηρίζονται και αποειδεολογικοποιούνται. Όταν ο Πολ Μακκάρτνεϊ, αναφέρθηκε κάποιες στιγμές για τους Beatles, όταν ο Πολ Μακκάρτνεϊ γράφει μια μουσική, μέσα στη μουσική του υπάρχει ο Μπαχ. Και μέσα στη μουσική του Μπαχ υπάρχουν τα μεσαιωνικά και αναγεννησιακά μαδριγάλια. Μιλάμε για μια πολιτισμική διαδρομή, η οποία ακριβώς η πολιτισμική διαδρομή διαμορφώνει και αυτό που ονομάζουμε εργοτέχνης. Δεν είναι δηλαδή τόσο ζήτημα απλά μιας ιδιοκτησίας. Δεν είναι απλά ζήτημα ενός δικαιώματος. Το δικαίωμα από τη μια μεριά είναι ατομικό, γιατί προφανώς εγώ έχω γράψει μια μουσική, την ίδια ώρα όμως είναι και πολιτισμικό, επειδή εγώ ακολουθώ μια διαδρομή η οποία τουλάχιστον στο δυτικό πολιτισμό μπορεί να έχει 2.000 χρόνια και να ξεκίνησε από την Ακρόπολη των Παρθενώνα που αναφέρθηκε πριν ή και πολύ παλιότερα. Άρα εμένα καταρχήν με ενοχλεί η ενσωμάτωσή μου μέσα σε ένα τεράστιο, μέσα σε μια τεράστια αποθήκη πληροφοριών, στις οποίες υπάρχουν ένα σωρό καταπληκτικές ιδέες της ανθρωπότητας, μουσικές, συγγραφικές. Με ενοχλεί η δυσαρμονία ως προς διάφορα είδη τέχνης, γιατί όπως αναφέρθηκε στην Σταματούδη χτες, ο χορός δεν έχει την ίδια επίπτωση, το θέατρο δεν έχει την ίδια επίπτωση, αλλά η μουσική και η λογοτεχνία, ο πλαγιαρισμός που συμβαίνει στη λογοτεχνία, είναι τρομακτικός. Με ενοχλεί, και επειδή ξέρω ότι αυτό θα συμβεί, οι πραγματιστές δικηγόροι μας λένε ότι αυτό συμβαίνει ήδη, άρα δεν έχει νόημα να πει κανείς ότι δεν πρόκειται να γίνει και ξαφνικά θα δημιουργηθεί ένα τέτοιο θέμα ηθικής συνείδησης που η ανθρωπότητα θα κάνει πίσω, αλλά τουλάχιστον να απαιτήσουμε να λέγονται έργα τέχνης και να υπάρχει ένα copyright το οποίο να είναι διαρκές, ενεργό και σταθερό. Και επίσης κάνω μια τελευταία σκέψη και σταματώ. Εάν μπορεί μια τεχνολογία να κάνει ένα sampling σε εκατοντάδων χιλιάδων σελίδων, ας πούμε, της πεζογραφίας, θα πρέπει τουλάχιστον η ίδια τεχνολογία να μπορεί και να αναγνωρίζει από πού έχει γίνει αυτό το σαμπλάρισμα.
Thank you. You also referred to copyright, but the topic is music in the digital age, and music is not just copyright, it's more than that. And in the debate on artificial intelligence, it might also not just be the copyright that needs our perspective. Chris, you referred to the No Fakes Act. That's not based on copyright, right?
No, that's not. And I have a bone to pick with the No Fakes Act, actually, because it is essentially taking a DMCA type notice and takedown, which tends to be notice and notice and notice and notice and notice and notice and notice, and applying it to name and likeness, essentially, or fakes, if you like. But that's not really a copyright bill. But it basically, I think the way you deal with these things is you create both a private right of action and a attorney general, a government civil action and a government criminal action against people who abuse these images. Like, for example, this Sora 2 thing, to me, is just a prime example of why, you need to have these protections built in for both living and dead. Because in many states in the United States, and I'm sure in other jurisdictions, the dead celebrities, particularly, not everybody necessarily, but anyone who exploited their name and likeness during their life, have a right to protection. Plus, what we're starting to find with Spotify, for example, and some of the other services, is that there are AI creations of works that are sound-alikes and maybe not so sound-alikes that end up getting tagged to the dead artist page on Spotify as though it was a work by that artist. And that's not really something that's covered by No Fakes, but it's something that needs to be covered, right, in other ways. And aside from just plain old common sense, which is really kind of the first threshold on these things. But it's not limited to copyright. It needs to take into account things like tone, voice, persona, personhood. Graham used the term personhood. I think that's a good one. The things that go into making somebody who they are, particularly as a musician or a performer.
Patricia, can we call that touching upon personality rights then? Because I know that you often enter into the discussion bringing personality rights to the table. I think the old records, you only put the sound in it, but right now as a musician, you're obliged to reach your audience using all audiovisual forms of media too. So every musician out there is not just giving his voice and his sound, but also his image, because you can only reach an audience if you also use audiovisual ways of reaching them. So maybe that brings the musicians and the actors actually even more closer together. Have you already learned specific lessons from the whole personality rights role in this whole AI debate?
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of the characteristics of this technology is that it's so disruptive that is able to create realistic digital imitations of the voice, likeness, the image. And of course, when we talk about actors or performers in general, we know that their voice, their likeness, their image are their tools of working. So the impact on that, for instance, in sectors like dubbing actors, is clear. They are seeing that they are being replaced by machines that have learned about, thanks to their performances. And the solution is not only on the hands of copyright. I think we need to think on other legal frameworks like personality rights. We need to think on data protection as well. And when we talk about personality rights, of course, the problem is that, for instance, in Europe, it's not harmonized, this topic. In Spain, we have a law of personality rights since 1992, but of course, we need that an update to adapt to the new circumstances. And it's not only the solution is not only to label the content and say, no, this is AI generated. We need the consent of the performers in order to use that. And I want to stress another thing that I believe is important and linked with the idea of the opting out. When we talk about performers, they have to opt out in the context of something bigger that is the audiovisual work. So we are seeing that, for instance, now some AI companies are trying to make deals with producers of audiovisual work. And of course the producer have something to say because it's the recordings that AI companies want to use, but the performance fixed there belongs to the performer as well. So it's important that when we talk about the use of the image, it's not only the image as a personality right that the actor has as a citizen, it's the image embedded in the performance that are fixed in this audiovisual work. So we need a solution that take all these aspects into account to protect performers.
Because if you limit it to a pure copyright debate, then definitely in audiovisual, you have no more say on, for instance, recordings older than 50 years. Exactly. And that's something that we see in practice today, that John Wayne's voice. So those, it's the plus 50 repertoire that is being used the most right now to generate these likeness and images. It's more on old movies than on current movies. Looking at other instruments, Mark, you, during the first panel, you asked a question on trade secrets. Now, Chris, in your presentation, you gave this example of Eric Clapton. So there was different eras, and somehow the machine knew the settings. One, it knew which amplifier was used, and it knew the settings of the amplifier. Can we consider that to be the artist's trade secret? And can we then use trade secret as a source to say, you cannot look at this because it's my trade secret?
I think this is an interesting approach. What you're saying and what Patricia was saying before makes me think, of course, about moral rights, which, as you know, are not harmonized in the EU and very often are not exercised. So the beauty about moral rights is that they really belong to authors and performers, and it's also good that they cannot be transferred. But in certain cases, the contractual counterparts of authors and performers, in a lot of cases where it's possible by law, they will ask authors and performers to waive those rights. And so, but I think, and of course, you know, for authors, it's quite complicated to exercise moral rights. Very often, they don't want to start a legal case, you know, against a big contractual partner with everything it means in terms of resources, effort, and so on. But I think with generative AI, moral rights are taking, you know, a new importance in a way. And so for us, it would be interesting to look at a possible harmonization and also to speak with contractual counterparts, publishers, to see how we can maybe together try to protect those rights. Because it's interesting to see that usually producers and publishers, they have been quite reluctant to you know, for moral rights, and very often they were saying, well, we are against it, it's gonna go against the exploitation of the work. I think now we are in a new era where we can see that in the US, where you have labels, publishers being interested in protecting the integrity of the work, in protecting the attribution of the work as well. So I think generative AI is raising a lot of new questions, and that we should look back at moral rights also with a new eye to make sure that they are respected and that, by online. But at the same time, I think so. I think it's very important to fight about deep fakes, but it's important also not to give a free pass to the tech industry, and by that I mean that we shouldn't only limit this debate about that and saying that there is a problem where the output is looking like the input. There is a general problem. And, if you take an analogy with the offline world, imagine you have a farmer producing tomatoes, and he has action against people stealing his tomatoes only if you can prove that the tomatoes are looking like the tomatoes he produced. If he was making a soup, you would say, no, there is no problem anymore. That's a bit what the tech industry is saying at the moment.
Chris, you wanted to react to that?
I just would add the one thing. We don't have to necessarily have new treaties or new laws to be able to do this, right? Lucian Grange, a name I know is not necessarily popular in this room, but Lucian recently said that Universal is going to look seriously at who they're doing business with in this context and whether they are respecting both Universal's rights but also the rights of their artists. And that, is kind of dancing around the edge of a secondary boycott kind of thing, but still it is something which could be solved by contract. And so you don't have to wait around to try to get a new law passed necessarily. You could just go to your distributor and just say, here's the deal, in or out. You want to opt out? I'm going to opt out of you unless you take care of the rights of my artists.
Giorgos, you also wanted to react to that.
Θα ήθελα να πω ότι αν πρέπει να γίνει μια ρηξικέλευτη τοποθέτηση, μια ισχυρή τοποθέτηση, θα είχε το νόημα να υποθεί από εμάς ότι δεν επιτρέπουμε την πρωτότυπη καλλιτεχνική δημιουργία μέσω της τεχνητής νοημοσύνης. Μπορεί η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη να είναι επιβοηθητική σε διαδικασίες παραγωγής και να μας ενημερώνει για το ποια είναι η ηλεκτρική κιθάρα και το Cry Baby Pedal του Eric Clapton, αλλά στην ουσία εγώ σαν δημιουργός αισθάνομαι ότι το ζήτημα είναι κατεξοχήν ηθικό, το αναφέρεται σε σχέση με την προστασία αυτού που ονομάζει στην Ελλάδα του ηθικού δικαιώματος, είναι το αν επιτρέπουμε τη δημιουργία ενός πρωτότυπου έργου τέχνης μέσα από αυτά τα fake μέσα. Αυτό είναι για μένα το κεντρικό ερώτημα και η κεντρική μου απορία, διότι εάν θεωρηθεί ότι το να μπορεί κανείς να μιμηθεί ένα έργο τέχνης παίρνοντας εκατομμύρια κομμάτια samplings και διαλέγοντας τα δικά του και μέσα από αυτό να ζητάει να το μετατρέψει σε εμπορικό προϊόν, υπάρχει η παγίδα της υποκατάστασης μιας κεντρικής ανθρώπινης ιδιότητας που είναι η τέχνη αυτή καθεαυτή. Διότι οι συνέπειες δεν είναι μόνο στο εμπορικό πεδίο ή στο ηθικό πεδίο για τον καλλιτέχνη. Είναι για συνολικά τον ανθρώπινο πολιτισμό. Γιατί ο άνθρωπος έχει επιλέξει την παραγωγή της τέχνης και για πολλούς διαφορετικούς λόγους εκτός από το να στηρίζει μια αγορά. Και ο κεντρικός είναι η μεταφυσική, η υπαρκτική σχέση. Σκεφτόμουν και μιλούσα με έναν φίλο μου προχτές και έλεγα ότι κάποια στιγμή μέσω της τεχνητής νοημοσύνης θα δημιουργηθεί ένα τεράστιο ζήτημα με τις θρησκείες. Αν αφαιθεί αυτή η δύναμη να παράγει μιμήσεις πρωτογενών προϊόντων, πρωτογενών έργων τέχνης, πρωτογενών φιλοσοφικών, ποιητικών έργων τέχνης, πάμε σε έναν μεταπολιτισμό στον οποίο το κεντρικό σημείο είναι η χρήση με έναν αλγοριθμικό τρόπο, με έναν αλγόριθμο της μέχρι τώρα καλλιτεχνικής δημιουργίας, που αυτό είναι τραγικό γιατί ο άνθρωπος πρέπει να εξελίσσει τη δημιουργία του και την τέχνη του. Το ζήτημα είναι να παράγονται τώρα έργα τέχνης, σπουδαία τα έργα τέχνης του παρελθόντος, αλλά ο άνθρωπος πρέπει να παράγει τα έργα τέχνης σήμερα. Συνεπώς, η πρόταση που ξέρω τις δυσκολίες της είναι να μην επιτρέπεται στην τεχνητή νοημοσύνη να παράγει πρωτότυπα έργα τέχνης και πολύ περισσότερο να μην τα βάζει σε καταλόγους μέσα στο Spotify και να τα αντιμετωπίζει ισότιμα με έργα δημιουργών και να παίρνει από αυτά χρήματα και να έχει όφελος.
Can I just add one thing on that?
Yeah.
You've raised a very important point because it's unclear to me exactly how these AI works are going to be included in the famous, pro rata royalty system, and also in the music discovery tools, right? Because, why in the world would you include particularly a purely AI work in the royalty pool? And if you include it, even if you don't include it in the numerator, if you include it in the denominator, it's just going to make the royalty smaller over time. So these are not hard things, but these are conversations that need to be had because we need to have a common understanding about this.
And we need to make an educated response to that, because you cannot just... What you need to take into account is what I want to talk about for the time that is left for us. The competition that we're actually getting. So on one hand, I've heard a lot, AI can be a tool and it can be a partner and it can help you in the creative process. But on the other hand, yes, AI is also producing stuff itself. I call it stuff, so I don't know, it's producing stuff. And it's already competing with the human-made music on platforms like Spotify, raising the question, do we need to include it in the royalty pool? On the other hand, that same music is being sold to shops, bars, and commercial services as rights-free music because it's not included in the royalty pool. So on one hand, it's competing for royalties, and on the other hand, it is actually competing by selling itself as royalty-free music. So that, again, it's a kind of unfair competition we're in. And so first, Giorgos, you as a musician, how do you look at shops using completely 100% AI-generated music, literally competing with the music licenses of our collective management organizations of authors and performers? Is that just something we have to get used to? Or is that something where you think the competition needs to be corrected because in the end they only exist because of us?
Το σίγουρο είναι ότι ένα έργο που παράγεται μέσα από την τεχνητή νοημοσύνη και έχει τη φιλοδοξία να ονομάζεται πρωτότυπο, όση απέχθεια και αν μου προκαλεί η λέξη πρωτότυπο, γιατί όπως εξήγησα και πριν δεν το θεωρώ πρωτότυπο, δεν μπορεί να πατάει σε δύο βάρκες. Δεν μπορεί δηλαδή τη μια στιγμή να αντιμετωπίζεται σαν πρωτότυπη δημιουργία, άρα μέσω αυτού να πρέπει να έχει royalties και όλη την προστασία του πνευματικού δικαιώματος, και την ίδια στιγμή, εφόσον δεν είναι δημιουργημένο από άνθρωπο, από ανθρώπινη συνείδηση, από έναν άνθρωπο καλλιτέχνη, να μπορεί να εξαιρείται από όλο αυτό το τεράστιο αγώνα που έχει γίνει για την προστασία του πνευματικού δικαιώματος σε παγκόσμιο επίπεδο. Εμείς στην Ελλάδα, και το λέω με στενοχώρια αυτό, ακόμα αγωνιζόμαστε να προστατέψουμε το πνευματικό δικαίωμα από πάρα πολλούς που το χειρίζονται με έναν τρόπο, θα έλεγα, όχι σύνομο, για να μην πω καμιά χειρότερη κουβέντα. Φανταστείτε σε τι τεράστιο ηθικό ζήτημα και σε τι τεράστια πρακτική δυσκολία μπαίνουμε όταν πρέπει να διαλέξουμε το πώς θα αντιμετωπίσουμε ένα δήθεν έργο τέχνης, η ωραία λέξη ελληνική είναι ένα ιονί έργο τέχνης, το οποίο από την άλλη μεριά όμως θα πωλείται σαν έργο τέχνης, θα φέρνει κέρδη, αλλά δεν θα υπάρχει πνευματικό δικαίωμα το οποίο να το συνοδεύει, ενώ κουβαλάει στην πλάτη τα πνευματικά δικαιώματα εκατοντάδων δημιουργών από τους οποίους έχει δανειστεί το στυλ, το ύφος, μελωδίες, σημαντικές ιδέες φιλοσοφικές ή λογοτεχνικές. Νομίζω για μένα ότι πρέπει να, επιστρέφω στην πρώτη μου τοποθέτηση, ότι πρέπει να απορριφθεί εντελώς με πολύ σκληρή μάχη η δυνατότητα να δημιουργούνται πρωτότυπα έργα, σε εισαγωγικά πάντοτε, δήθεν πρωτότυπα έργα, μέσω της τεχνητής νοημοσύνης. Δεν πιστεύω, ως δημιουργός ο οποίος έχει υποφέρει από την εκμετάλλευση του έργου του, από την μη πληρωμή πνευματικών δικαιωμάτων, από την πλάγια εκμετάλλευση σε πολλαπλά επίπεδα, δεν πιστεύω ότι εάν ανοίξουμε την κερκόπορτα, ανοίξουμε την πόρτα, βάλουμε το δούριο ύπο και πώς λέμε για την τρία, γιατί όλο με μύθους μιλάμε, και μπούμε μέσα στην τρία με τη τεχνητή νοημοσύνη σαν δημιουργό ή συνδημιουργό, πιστεύω ότι δεν θα μπορέσουμε ποτέ ξανά να τη βγάλουμε έξω. Γι' αυτό είπα και στο Welcome το πρωί, ότι να μην μπλέξουμε με τη μυθολογία τύπου της Λερναίας Ύδρας που κόβεις ένα κεφάλι και βγαίνουν δύο.
Thank you. Any advice on Troy coming from Greeks is advice to take into consideration. Mark, how do you remember, because the public performance of AI-generated music is in the end just an example of how it can affect us. We see other models being able to generate complete compositions. We heard yesterday that performers should not complain because we can still perform these in a live environment. So, but how do your members look at this competition that we're now getting from AI? Because in the end, we're getting competition.
Absolutely. I mean, they look at it a bit, terrified, looking at this as a huge unfairness in a way. But I think it's hard at the same time to try to anticipate what will be the public taste, for generative AI. I think now sometimes you have a AI hype, you're looking at a video, at some music, and you say, wow, it's technically, well done. At the same time, for me, with always a lack of soul. And, beyond the kind of hype, I'm not sure it's the kind of music that people would like to hear. That's my personal opinion. On something that I would like to say as well is that I see a slippery slope in terms of terminology, and I think we should be very aware and vigilant about this. Because as you said, I mean, for me, copyright, authors' rights, and performers' rights, they are here to protect, a work of art. And in the last years, we've seen that the word data, the term data, has been used basically to cover also works protected. And also the term of opt-out. In the directive in 2019, you don't have the term opt-out. You have the term reservation of rights. And it's very different, and we should be careful about this, because the reservation of rights, you should be able to do it once. And you should not, we should not be entertained by the ideas that opting out should be a full-time job. Now you need to opt out from generative AI on LinkedIn as well, for example. On each service, you have to actively opt out, which is kind of a shame, and which also applies more and more for GDPR, actually. So I think we need to be very careful not to fall in this trap of this terminology trap in a way.
Patricia, from the actor's point of view, but actually general performer's point of view, how do you look at this competition?
With a lot of concerns. Let me put you an example. 2 weeks ago, the public TV from the Basque Country announced that they are very happy because the acquisition of a program of AI for dubbing and subtitling shows and films. And they say, now we are going to do this faster and cheaper, So the problem is that they are using AI to replace the human cost. Dubbing actors are very affected for that. And we all know that when we talk about actors, being an actor and to become famous is very difficult. They are under a lot of pressure. So now they have to add the pressure of this technology. And I'm thinking how this technology and the use of this technology can put more pressure when they negotiate their contracts with the producers. Because if you don't want that, you know what? You can be replaced. Or we are going to pay less because there are some of the scenes that probably AI will do better. Of course, we know that the film industry has been used this kind of technology for a long time and for do wonderful things. But the problem now is that they want to use to make more profits, saving money, replacing actors and actresses. And this is the concern that the sector have with all of that. And on the top of that, thinking that this content can be generated, thank you to the fact that they use your previous content without your permission and no remuneration. So it's like, okay, what else?
A final question before giving the floor to the room, giving the mic to the room. Alexandru, he mentioned this morning that actually we have the power. It's the creators that have the power to decide which platform, which AI developer will make it and which ones will not. Because as he mentioned, they are right now also in a competition with each other. So we also have to acknowledge that. So they're probably not all going to survive as viable businesses. So what can we do? Are there examples that you have of, okay, I like this one because at least they're doing this. So are there any best practices that we have right now from any of the providers out there that we can refer to as, okay, this is good guy behavior and this is bad actor? You already mentioned bad actor. Sorry, Microsoft. I mean, if you dig into a pirated database, that is bad acting. You can then come up with, we don't go behind a paywall, but if you have other bad acting, it kind of compensates. But are there any other examples of good intentions, good actor, bad actor?
Η ερώτηση είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα. Συγχρόνως όμως είναι μια ερώτηση η οποία με βάζει να σκεφτώ έξω από το κάδρο της αμιγούς χρηστικότητας. Τι θέλω να πω με αυτό? Θέλω να πω ότι στερεί μια θέση εργασίας από κάποιον άνθρωπο μια τέτοια τακτική ή προοπτική. Και αν αυτός ο ένας άνθρωπος γίνει εκατοντάδες άνθρωποι και χιλιάδες άνθρωποι, αν αυτοί οι άνθρωποι εξαθλιωθούν, γιατί πολλά από τα επαγγέλματα που μέχρι εκείνη τη στιγμή χρησιμοποιούσαν και ασκούσαν δεν υπάρχουν πια, επειδή κάποιος αποφασίζει ότι είναι μια πιο φθηνή λύση να πάει μέσω της τεχνητής νοημοσύνης, τι συμπέρασμα θα βγάλει κανείς για τον ανθρώπινο πολιτισμό συνολικά? Αυτό που με απασχολεί περισσότερο είναι το να προσπαθήσουμε εμείς οι δημιουργοί, οι καλλιτέχνες και όλο το σύστημα που μας υποστηρίζει, είτε είναι νομικό, είτε είναι πνευματικών και συγγενικών δικαιωμάτων, να σταθεί σε μια υποστήριξη που δεν θα είναι μόνο τεχνοκρατική και νομική, αλλά να είναι και φιλοσοφική και ηθική και πολιτιστική. Τα επιχειρήματα δηλαδή που έχουμε αυτή τη στιγμή, οι επιφυλάξεις που έχουμε, η οριοθέτηση που θέλουμε να βάλουμε στην τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, να υποστηριχτούν πέρα από τα νομικά σημαντικά επιχειρήματα που ακούω με πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον από τους ειδικούς εδώ ανθρώπους και επιστήμονες, να υποστηριχτούν και από τις πνευματικές προσωπικότητες των καλλιτεχνών. Έτσι ώστε αυτό όλο να μπει στη σωστή βάση του, που δεν είναι μόνο χρηστική, οικονομοτεχνική, αλλά έχει να κάνει με την ιστορία της ανθρωπότητας, του ανθρώπινου είδους, τον τρόπο που διατηρεί ένα δικαίωμα. Επιτρέψτε να σας πω μια πολύ μικρή ιστορία που έχει πολύ ενδιαφέρον. Για 19 χρόνια ήμουνα διευθυντής σε ένα φεστιβάλ πολιτισμού σε ένα μικρό νησί, στην Αστυπάλαια. Εκεί λοιπόν αποφασίσαμε με τον Δήμαρχο κάποιους δρόμους που οδηγούσαν σε ορισμένες υπέροχες παραλίες να μην τους ασφαλτοστρώσουμε, να μην τους κάνουμε καλύτερους. Να τους αφήσουμε με το χώμα, με τον τρόπο που να μπορεί κάποιος να τους περπατήσει, να κάνει περισσότερη ώρα, αλλά να είναι σαν μια κληρονομιά στους επόμενους. Ας το κάνουν οι επόμενοι σταδιακά, με μεγαλύτερη σοφία. Δεν πιστεύω στην ιδέα της γραμμικής προόδου. Η ιδέα της γραμμικής προόδου είναι ένα λάθος της ανθρωπότητας και ειδικά του πολιτισμένου κόσμου. Ότι πρέπει να προοδεύουμε, άρα να κάνουμε τα πράγματα πιο εύκολα, άρα να μπορούμε να κάνουμε τα πάντα, να μετατρεπόμαστε δηλαδή σε μικρούς θεούς. Είναι αυτή η λαθεμένη αντίληψη. Δεν είμαστε μικροί θεοί. Πρέπει να προστατεύσουμε την πολιτιστική μας κληρονομιά και το δικαίωμά μας να παράγουμε τέχνη έτσι όπως την παράγει ο άνθρωπος από τότε που στα γαλλικά σπήλαια έβαλε τις παλάμες του και είπε υπάρχω, είμαι εδώ.
Again, thank you very much. And the Greeks have dealt with more gods than anyone else. So here again, it's advice to take into account. Chris, you've mentioned during your presentation, these are the same guys as the Internet 1.0. In all your experience with these same guys, are there some you get along with better because of their good behavior and because of their better moral behavior? Let me say it like that. You don't have to answer it. You can just...
Well, I always say I would be more inclined to trust them if I could think of the 5 trust-making things they've done in the last 25 years. But I can't. Right? And the truth is, they don't really care. You know, I mean, they're and now there is so much money in this pot that, you know, notwithstanding the circularity of some of these deals and, you know, that are reminiscent of the old internet carriage deals, you know, there's just so much money that you're going to have a really hard time getting their attention. But I do think there is a leverage point, which is not just for us as in our business, but for humans in general. And that is the fact that these people are going to be chowing down huge amounts of electricity and burning huge amounts of water. And the water, I mean, I have a ranch, okay? I'm in the country. I have a slightly different viewpoint on a lot of this stuff, you know, and I know that my neighbors who are ranchers are not going to tolerate, you know, this water issue, okay? Water is a thing. And also when you have these data centers that are just some massive numbers of data centers that are coming in and wanting to set up nuclear reactors, so that they have, you know, constant flow of electricity. We seem to, a lot of these same people were around for the, you know, net zero carbon. That's gone. Okay? Nobody's talking about that anymore, right? Because they can't do the new thing if they stick with the old thing. So I think that there will be points in time at which the public will be able to get more involved in this in different ways. And I think we have to sort of encourage that because there's ways that we can collaborate, you know, with those pain points that will help us also with our pain points. Because, you know, whether, you know, somebody does a funny video of Elvis Presley is not going to necessarily matter. Well, that one might actually matter to some of my neighbors, but some of the others will not, you know, but the water will, and the electric will.
And don't forget that, and it's important in the cultural sector, that is all paid for with taxpayers' money.
Well, exactly.
Because their business model does not allow them to pay it for themselves. In the EU, we just heard the numbers that Ursula von der Leyen is going to throw at this industry. We could make culture for hundreds of years with the money that they're putting in this industry.
Yeah, on
Mark,
the paperclip budget.
You wanted to react to that.
No, yes, absolutely. I think we should have a look at culture and AI, you know, looking at the specificities of culture as well. Because, you know, AI is very much in other sectors about like gaining efficiency, for example, but what does that mean, efficiency in the cultural side? We can't have simply copy-paste, you know, the AI for other sectors and for the cultural sector. I think this is something important, and in other contexts, like the trade negotiation, the EU has usually been protecting the cultural exception. I think there is one kind of cultural exception for AI as well. Then coming back to transparency and copyright, I think one of the things that we should try to put in place is a presumption of users of generative AI providers that they have been using copyrighted works, because otherwise they would always hide the fact that they've been taking everything which is on the publicly available internet, as they say, which also includes a lot of copyrighted work. So we should reverse the burden of proof, and to the advantage of right holders, because very often they admit it themselves, like Microsoft this morning. They have been taking actually everything from YouTube, for example. So I think we should reverse the burden of proof and make sure that we, as authors, performers, right holders, have much more easy time to prove that that our works have been used. It should be up to them to prove that they did not use our works, or prove that they have a license, some kind of authorization scheme.
Thank you. There's a clock in front of me, but so I'm going to open the floor for questions. Please shortly introduce yourself before speaking. Yeah, we hear you. Perfect.
Good morning. I'm Argyris Theos from CMO Socrates. I want to add something, especially to what Mr. ANDREOU said. I'm from the film industry, and over there is a serious problem upcoming, because the film industry has embraced AI technology, but as you know, film industry involves too many persons. Now, the head of departments, whether a director or a cinematographer or production designer, etc., 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 they always work their way from the bottom up. So you don't, graduate at university and say, I'm a director. No, you're not. You have to work for years until you become. Now, AI is cutting the low-level jobs. So we are losing this bucket of people where the talented ones would evolve up. This is a serious problem. I'm sure this applies to actors as well, because acting students may often work as extras. Now they don't use extras, they create them digitally. Or when they begin in their career, they might go into dubbing to gain experience in speaking. And then again, they're losing these jobs. So this is an overall problem on how AI is not only cutting jobs today on a short view, but its existence will limit the artistic efficiency of the future. I'm deeply worried about that. Thank you.
And composers, too, I would add. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that reflection. Is there anyone who wants to react to that? I think it's a very, I have never heard that point before, and thank you for that one.
Yeah, I think it's an example that we need a discussion beyond copyright issues and a commitment as a society to say, okay, we are going to protect human talent. I heard a lot of times saying the European Commission that they want a human-centric artificial intelligence. Now it's time to say, okay, what it means that exactly. And I think one of the commitments is to say we cannot replace human talent by machines. And again, I think the solution is not just labeling the content to allow the consumer to know when is using content generated by AI or not. It's a real commitment between the industry, the society, the public sector saying, no, we want to use human talent instead of this kind of machines.
Can I just add, there's also like an essential aspect to this in some ways. We have some colleagues who are in the illustrators partnership, and one of them is a medical illustrator. And one of her concerns is that some of the medical textbook publishers are starting to use AI for medical illustrations, which are actually a very refined talent to be able to do that, and is also getting it very, very wrong, which is not a real comforting thing when you go down to the ER, But these are all areas that, I think are ripe for really meaningful regulation that just not getting paid attention to at all.
Thank you. We have a second question from Paul, and then
Yes.
the mic for the third question can already go to the back.
Thank you. This is to all of you. Are you aware of any studies or surveys that, similarly to authors, CISAC, for example, produced one, showed or measured somehow the exact amount of damage done by AI to performers, to musicians, to actors, any specific branches of performers, because convincing decision makers is usually done by hard facts. So are you aware of any such surveys or studies that would quantify the damage done? Thank you.
I would point out that in the Kadri case, the case against MITDA, Judge Chabria, who ruled in favor of fair use, wrongly I think, but ruled in favor of fair use, made a point that the lawyers had not demonstrated that kind of harm in the case, but that maybe it won't be necessary because of AI flooding the market. So there may actually be an argument that we don't really need to show harm in specific, but that we can show it in general. So I just throw that out there. It's a very good opinion. I commend it to you.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. The first one over there, and then the next mic can already go to Horace.
Laurent Tardif from the French Union of Musicians. So I'm not asking for solutions for the moment, but we need solutions because we have a huge problem with the generative AI, and especially with deepfake. This deepfakes is a tricky question because the definition of the deepfake is very wide. Before somebody referred to a solo. I don't remember if it's Jeff Beck solo, a guitar solo, or Frank Zappa. But if you're imitating it, it's a deepfake. And I think we have to understand what's the economy of the deepfake today. Who earns money with deepfake today? Because perhaps it's a way to have a solution to reorientate some part of this economy to the performers, the artists, and so on. The limit is about the right of personality that was referred to before. Somebody underlined that in the EU, it's not a question that is harmonized. About rights of personality, I'm very cautious because, do my voice, do my likeness, could be one thing that could be in the single market, It's human, it's something human, and it's perhaps we have to treat it specially. But there is a big problem about the contracts that we are observing now that are between, for example, in the audiovisual industry and artists. But with the musician, we will have the same problem because the deepfake program, the personality rights, it's the same for musicians. And I think we need a strong framework for the contracts that could be made between artists, performers, and producers. And I looked with a lot of interest of the No Fakes Act in the United States, but there is a huge problem with that, and also with post-mortem using of the and so on. So we have to go deeper in our reflection. So, and the solution will be this afternoon, I suppose.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to the statement that we should actually broaden the definition of what is deepfake? It's not just when the whole image and likeness is taken into a reproduction of someone, but the entry level of entering into deepfake should actually be lower.
100%. And if you look at I don't even think this goes far enough, but if you look in the Tennessee, they call it the Elvis Act, which is kind of a deepfakes adjacent piece of legislation. There's some good definitions. Digital replicas comes up. That just got amended in California. So there's some examples out there of this. But I think your general point that we need to have, we in this room need to have some thought to giving some guidelines for collective bargaining agreements and just negotiations in general about how to connect these dots. Because there's many dots and they're just kind of floating out there in space, and they need to be kind of connected in a rational way to incorporate all these protections.
Thank you. Mark, really short, because right now we have competition from lunch and we still have 2 questions to be asked, so really short, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to say that I think it's Article 50 of the EU AI Act, which says that you have to put in place some labeling obligation for AI-generated manipulated content. This will has to be implemented with implementation guidelines. I hope it will be better than the implementation package of the EU AI Act so far, but there is some things there to look at.
I adore that you're still hopeful. Hers.
Yeah, I'll be very, very brief. Mark, I think you mentioned moral rights, and you said that there was some interest in the argument around moral rights as being, something performers could use, interest from the producers themselves, which I found fascinating because obviously they're the ones who've always objected to us having moral rights. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
No, I was just referring to the fact that for me, what I've seen, for example, in the US is that IFPI was, for example, very much, I think, pushing for some rules on likeness against deepfakes and so on. That's, and obviously in the US there is no moral rights. The audiovisual but also music industry have been opposed to moral rights in general. So I'm just thinking that it's interesting to see now that they want to protect the integrity of the work and performances.
Thank you. We have one last question.
First of all, good afternoon to everyone and congratulations to the organizers, because I think this is one of the best conferences I have ever attended, and I have attended a lot, as Mr. Labrianidis knows. Ian, I will do a lawyer's trick. And, okay, I will not ask about the solutions themselves, but I would like even a reaction from you, especially Mr. Castle, about if you see as part of the solution and to what degree the technology and the AI itself. Because you referenced back in 1919 where we had the technological measures of protection as a reaction, then electrifying the fence and all this culture that artists used in favor of them. So do you see technology and AI as a way to enforce your rights finally?
I accept your lawyer's trick, and I'm even going to use this as the question for the final round. Can everyone respond that question? To what extent can the actual AI help us defeat AI? Because that's how I make a summary of your question. And let's start with Chris and then finish the line.
It's funny you should say that. What I have, this is a little Twilight Zone-y, but when I have engaged with some of these chatbots, I get the distinct impression that they don't really like the guidelines that have been imposed on them, and they know this is wrong. Now, that's an eerie kind of thing to say, okay? But you know, I go with it. And you can ask them. What I found with the chatbot is that the chatbot's favorite subject is the chatbot, right? So it's more than willing to talk about itself. And it will, if you ask it, if you say, so if I was going to deal with this problem, how would you do it, right? And it'll tell you. And sometimes it's a pretty interesting solution, right? So I think that there are definitely things that can be done, but they would require getting hold of the AI at the developer level, which is a hard thing to do. It can be done with a special, and there's ways legally it can be done with a special master and a court order, and you know, probably protective orders, of course, you know, and that sort of thing. But I think that we don't really know the full scope of how we could use it to help us, because the people who are running it are using it to hurt us. And if we can't get hold of the thing itself, it's going to be a little difficult. But that doesn't mean we can't try, and that doesn't mean that there aren't some things that can be done along the way that we would be able to implement.
Thank you. YIORGOS?
Θέλω να πω απλά ότι ένα χαρακτηριστικό του δυτικού κόσμου είναι η υψηλή προσπάθεια εξειδίκευσης. Το πρόβλημα που συζητάμε και η ερώτησή σας έχει έντονα πολιτικά χαρακτηριστικά. Δεν είναι θέμα αν μπορεί η τεχνολογία να αποκαλύψει την παραβατικότητα ενός άλλου κομματιού τεχνολογίας. Το ζήτημα είναι εάν υπάρχει η πολιτική και η κοινωνική βούληση να συμβεί αυτό, γιατί μέσα σε αυτόν τον ακραίο καπιταλισμό στον οποίο έχει διολυστήσει ένα μεγάλο κομμάτι της Δύσης με αυτές τις υπερεταιρείες οι οποίες μετατρέπονται πια σε ισχυρότερες οντότητες από ό,τι κυβερνήσεις και κράτη, υπάρχει μια καινούρια, γι' αυτό στο τέλος του Welcome μου μίλησε για τη Γαλλική Επανάσταση και για τις αρχές της, γιατί στην ουσία μιλάμε για μια πολιτική πια τοποθέτηση, δεν αρκεί η τεχνοκρατική για τόσο μεγάλα ζητήματα. Γιατί όπως πολύ σωστά υπόθηκε πριν, κάποιοι θίγονται, κάποιοι απαγορεύουν την προσέγγιση και την αποκάλυψη και κάποιοι έχουν υπερκέρδη. Άλλωστε η ιστορία της καπιταλιστικής ανθρωπότητας ήταν πάντοτε η ίδια. Το υπερκέρδος και πώς μπορεί να το περιορίζεις και να το εκλογικεύσεις.
Thank you. Mark?
Yes, I can only appreciate when someone ends the panel with reference to the French Revolution. No, just to say that for us, I think it would be possible to trace, you know, the input from the output. I know that there are some EU-funded projects trying to look at this. I think with, as you said, with political will, everything is possible. But it, you know, is there a willingness from generative AI companies to share the data? That's the whole question.
Patricia?
Definitely, yes. AI could be part of the solution. It's a question of willingness, and it's a question of a good regulation that protect all the interest.
Thank you. And Chris, I had the same experience as you with ChatGPT. The machine knows how to respect company policy. So we should now have it respect public policy. So anything, and so there is a future. Okay. I want to thank these four people. Can we have an applause for our four panelists?